Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 2004 book by Michael W. Kauffman, American Brutus, John Wilkes Booth, and the Lincoln Conspiracies. So this is kind of a detour in our little sort of Abraham Lincoln exploration. We still have one book yet to get through in that dive, but here we're going to talk a little bit more and do a little bit more of a deep dive into the assassination of Lincoln on April the 14th of 1865. Now, Michael W. Kauffman is a very prominent scholar and researcher of the Lincoln assassination. He graduated from the University of Virginia. He was affiliated with the Surratt House Museum, the house of course, Mary Surratt and the kind of Lincoln conspirators, where like a lot of that stuff was kind of housed. And he led prominent kind of like these like 12-hour long bus tours that would kind of retrace the entire escape route of John Wilkes Booth from DC to the famous barn where he was captured and killed. Now, Kauffman's whole big thing is that he is a Lincoln assassination expert. That has been sort of the focus of his research, the focus of his expertise for a very long time, since as far back as the late 60s, from what I can gather, in kind of the post-JFK years, which is what sparked his interest. And because of that, American Brutus, the book here, is very much what feels like the culmination of a lifetime's worth of research. 30 plus years of research going into what becomes ultimately this book. The focus here is a detailed retelling, first off, of the events of the assassination, to the point where it's essentially almost a minute by minute telling that is spread over several chapters of just the events of the evening of April 14th, the morning of April 15th, and that sort of thing. And then you get, of course, some background of Booth himself, of the other conspirators, how they were kind of drawn into the plot. And then, of course, you get to follow kind of the journey, not just Booth's journey, but the sort of investigation piece of it, how the investigation put the clues together that resulted in not Booth being incriminated, because they knew Booth did it right away because people recognized him at the theater, but all the other folks who were involved in the Lincoln plot, and of course William Seward nearly being assassinated, and the plots on Andrew Johnson's life at that time, the vice president. Just watching kind of the investigation get kind of assembled through kind of piecemeal status, and how they were able to then track down Booth using these kind of very small leads and things like that and catch up to him. It's really fascinating. And when I say that this feels like a lifetime's worth of work, I mean the detail here is extraordinary. I cannot imagine, short of inventing a time machine and actually going back to watch these events, I cannot imagine a more detailed breakdown of these events than what we get right here. The amount of just information, the amount of exposition, I suppose, and the amount of explanation as far as to not just what the motives were, but the thought process, the detailing of individual conversations that people were having on the night, and again over the kind of 12-day manhunt afterwards. The level of detail here is extraordinary. And you can tell that this is coming from someone who has mined every individual resource that it is possible to mine, every testimonial, every diary entry, every interview after the fact. And in the process, you see some myths that kind of get taken down. Like, again, you will never read a better description of the events of the night of April 14th than what you read right here, because it dispels some of the myths and actually expands upon a little bit towards the very end, kind of how the myths sort of grew in esteem, right? The fact that, the president was extremely visible in his box when he was shot, even though that's actually not true from what we understand. They could barely see him. what Booth may or may not have said after the fact, how he exited. Did he break his leg on stage? I mean, Kauffman makes it pretty clear that Booth almost certainly did not break his leg jumping onto the stage, and he did so later he did so after leaving the theater. I mean, just that attention to detail, and then the description of all kind of the significance of what happened afterwards, and Lincoln being carried over to the Peterson house in the same bed where Booth had been lying in himself just days prior, while meeting with somebody, that the owner of the Peterson house had to leave because his 2 daughters had died in the same bed, I think, and he was just very emotionally disturbed by the whole thing. I mean, just so much. It's surprising how much of a punch this book has emotionally, but there are several moments like that. Like, you get to watch the reactions of Booth's family kind of throughout, his brothers, his sister, and other folks who kind of related, and you get to see the just devastating psychological impact that has on people who I think always had reason to suspect that he was not in his best, in a great place, and that he was kind of unhinged, but didn't suspect that he was capable of doing something like that. And so getting to see kind of the reactions there is pretty powerful as well. And again, just the overview of the actual manhunt, the actual investigation, how, in some cases, just the sheer luck that went into nabbing certain members of the conspiracy is pretty remarkable. And then towards the end, they go into the discussion of the actual trials for the conspirators and the frankly inhumane ways that they were treated, and how, very much the country and the laws at the time were set up to essentially ensure conviction. And the fact that the trial was done by a military tribunal essentially more or less assured it. It's a hard-hitting look, and it certainly shows just how much misinformation was kind of spread around at that time, even just the various different stories about the events of the assassination night itself and how that played into popular narrative. And then how, of course, when everything was said and done, that, there was a bloodlust throughout the country, throughout the government, and these people who were getting put on trial were going to be made examples of. And the story of Mary Surratt, I think in particular, is very telling of that, very emblematic of that. Although she's given a very three-dimensional caricature as well, in the sense that it's very clear that she was actually complicit in quite a few things that went on, in quite a bit of what went on, but that she was sympathetic, a very sympathetic figure because of her status being a woman and the fact that the American government had never executed a woman before, that sort of thing. It's just, there's so much. There's a lot of kind of, it's an event in history that feels black and white when you read about it in the history books. The status of Lincoln as America's greatest president, gunned down at the moment where he was at his most successful, essentially, with the Civil War being ended. And a book like this really just kind of strips back a little bit of that mythos and says, hey, there's certainly a lot of truth to that, but there's a lot of kind of darker and much more complex stuff that's going around here. And it's just, it's fascinating. It's compelling. I don't know. I was really struck by the detail, as I said. I think the pacing of it is remarkable. I know Kauffman has not written all that much, as far as published literature necessarily. I think he's done a lot of articles and stuff, but I think for someone whose background is taking this type of history and distilling it for a popular audience, if this guy is doing tours, essentially, he's essentially been a tour guide for a long time, then he is very aware of how to take these ideas and distill it into a way that the average person can understand and make it consistently engaging. That's what you have to do as a tour guide. And just to do that mixture of accessibility and just academic detail and just complete, all-encompassing just scope with this whole narrative. It's stellar. It's extraordinarily well done. Hard for me to see how there's a better book out there that covers this topic. I think there's a book called Manhunt, if I'm not mistaken, that came out a few years after this one, which I have not read, but I'm given to believe that it doesn't really approach this in terms of that level of scope and that level of detail. So while that's the one that I think you're more likely to see at bookstores at this point, American Brutus is what I would go with. I don't think you're ever going to find a more compelling and more accurate and more detailed description of the events of what happened than this one right here. It's stellar. It's enthralling. It's one of the best books about like a single event, a single short-term period of history that I've read in a very long time. And for me, it's as good as almost anything I've read for this Lincoln dive so far. And it's stellar. It's exceptional. I would check it out. With that, I want to say thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.